I would like to begin by thanking you for that very kind introduction and the offer to give this lecture. It's a real pleasure to be here. As far as a small wink to design, I plan on giving a big wink to design. It's kind of the important word that will connect the two aspects of my talk today. So before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about kind of the work that I do so you can contextualize everything. And I hope you can hear everything clearly. So my training is in psychology. So I'm an experimental psychologist and I study creativity. But as anybody who studies creativity, we also have a big interest in understanding aesthetics. In other words, how people respond to the products of the creative process in terms of preferences. And what I would like to do today is, and it's kind of ambitious for a 45-minute talk, but I'm going to touch on both the creative aspects of architectural design and how we appreciate the products of architectural design. And I want to make a point that these two things are really connected. So in the literature writ large, you kind of have two silos. You've got the work on creativity. We kind of tend to hang out with other creativity people. And then there are people who do work on aesthetic appreciation involving work on architecture and design. But these two communities don't really meet. But there's a real reason to think that work from psychology and neuroscience of design can bring these two fields together. And that's going to be the overarching aim of my lecture today. So this is the overview of my talk, just so you kind of have an idea of where I'm going to go to. So my talk will sort of have two halves. In the first half of my talk, I want to talk about the classic studies in the scientific study of creativity, many of which were heavily informed by creativity in architecture. I want to kind of bring to the forefront the wonderful contribution that architecture has made to our understanding of the creative mind. Okay, this field is about 70 years old, and I think that some of the most important studies to kickstart everything were studies of architects. And I want to talk about this incredible database that exists at University of California, Berkeley, that I was able to access a few years ago, that enabled us to test a very important hypothesis, which is there any kind of connection between the creativity of the architect who's making a design product and the extent to which it is experienced as a beautiful object by the end user? Okay, this is a assumption that we make implicitly, but it hasn't been tested empirically before. In other words, if you're walking in a city and you come across a beautiful piece of architecture and you are imbued by a sense of creativity in that work, does your assessment of that work from an aesthetic perspective tell you something about the creativity of the person who built it? Okay. Then after I've talked about that, really kind of talking about the creative aspect of architectural design, I'm going to switch gears and talk about what I do most of my work now on, which is the neuroscience of architecture, which is how does our brain respond to design features in architecture? And as many of you who do work in architecture and design would know, is that there's potentially an endless number of design features one could focus on in architecture. So we did some intense study to narrow it down to 3 that we could manipulate systematically inside the fMRI scanner. And those are the features of contour. So whether the design is or curvy, ceiling height, which has a lot of impact on how we think and feel, and I'll talk about that. And finally, perceived enclosure. So whether the space that you find yourself in allows you to imagine looking out or imagining moving out of. Okay, and then given that I only have 45 minutes, I'm going to end by talking about some of our current work, and I'll then open the floor to discussions, and hopefully we'll have a great chat afterwards, okay? So I encourage everyone to get your glasses of wine ready, and let's go on a tour together, okay? So studies of creative architects. So one of the most amazing databases of creativity in the world was collected at University of California, Berkeley. So these studies were started in the 19... It's called IPAR, which stands for Institute of Personality Assessment and Research. And they were given a very big grant by the US government to study effectively functioning persons. Okay, so they came to realize very soon that a very important aspect of being an effectively functioning person is a person's level of creativity. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to bring different groups of people to Berkeley who were exhibiting very high levels of creativity, and they wanted to understand what it is that makes them creative. So they had creative writers, creative poets, creative mathematicians, space scientists, etc. And not surprisingly, one of the very first groups to be added to this list were creative architects. So architecture is a wonderful domain to study creativity because it needs to fulfill both form and function to be successful. And this works really beautifully with our working definition of what is creative. So people who study creativity consider an idea or a product to be creative if it fulfills two functions. It has to be novel and it has to be useful. Okay, and you can think the same way about a piece of architecture, whether it fulfills novelty and utility for it to be successfully creative. It's important to emphasize that novelty and usefulness are not given equal weight. So what's more important is novelty, and to a secondary degree, usefulness is very important. The other thing which is really great about architecture is it allows you to study both the creation of a creative product and how it's appreciated. Okay, and of course we have lots of different methodologies in experimental psychology to study the creative process in design. So we have designers coming to our labs and we give them, for example, the task of designing a space. And while they're working on that design process, you can ask them to engage in what we call the think aloud technique, where they verbalize what they're talking about in a course of cognition. And you can score and analyze those in lots of different ways to see how the mind of a creative architect works in the course of the design process. Okay, so at IPAR, they invited 40 world-renowned architects to Berkeley for a week. Okay, and it's an amazing data set because they are giants of 20th century architecture. They were given extensive tests for a whole week, and they were also excellent criterion variables of creativity. So really good measures to tell you actually how creative they are. Okay, these are some of the famous people who were part of that sample: Louis Kahn, Eero Saarinen, Philip Johnson, I.M. Pei, and all of these people got paid to fly to Berkeley for a week. Their accommodations were taken care of, and they woke up every morning and they went to the lab and they met a bunch of psychologists in white suits, and they were given lots of different tests that people thought would be important for studying how creative they are. Okay, so it's one of those rare cases where you're studying people for whose creativity is not in question. Okay, in a specific domain. Okay, they were given measures of cognitive ability, personality, perception, divergent thinking, and if anybody in this in seeing the full list of measures, I can send you a link from the study that will give you a full set to look at if you're interested in having a look at the data set yourself. Okay, so all of these architects were rated on creativity by the editors of the most important architecture journals, by other experts in the field, so a big group of expert architect panel, and also every single person in the pool rated the creativity of other people in the pool. So it's fantastic to see, for example, Louis Kahn and Eero Saarinen rating each other's creativity. And I loved how everyone rated themselves clearly higher than others had rated them, which, is a little psychological tidbit to enjoy. So the big question we had was, okay, so these people were great. Everyone knows they're great, amazing architects. They built amazing structures in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. But now this is 50 years later. Does the eminence of them at the time predict how popular their works are now? Okay, so is there a way for you to glean something about their creativity when you're looking at their work? And fortuitously for us, a few years ago was the 150th anniversary of the American Institute of Architects. Okay, so what they did was they ran a big survey in America where they asked several thousand people what their favorite architecture was. Okay, so they asked people who are members of the regular public, and they also asked people who are members of AIS, so these are working architects. Okay, so these lists were published. You can see some of people's favorite buildings. These are some of the buildings by the four people whom I talked about. There's a wonderful airport hall by Eero Saarinen. There's a beautiful one by Louis Kahn, Philip Johnson. So all of these buildings made this famous list of America's favorite architecture. Okay, so the question we had was, does the creativity of these architects in the 50s predict whether their work would be on the list of most favorite architecture in America 50 years later? Okay, and what we found is that it's actually indeed true. Okay, so regardless of whether you're looking at editors' creativity ratings or expert rate in the 50s predicts how popular their work is 50 years later, which means that there is something about the creativity of the architect that's transmitted through features of the work to the viewer, which is a remarkable thing. Okay, so the artifact represents something about the creativity of the creator. Now, I have a really good friend who lives in the Bay Area. He is a working architect, Pierluigi Sereno. He wrote a beautiful book about this project that came out a few years ago called The Creative Architect. So it's a book that's devoted entirely to this particular study, covering lots of other measures that I haven't tested in my own research, but I really highly recommend this book. It's a wonderful read for anybody that's interested in creativity of architects, but particularly people who are students of architecture and design and want to have a better understanding of how creativity researchers look at their domain. Okay? It's a really great book. Again, if you email Maya or me after my lecture, I'll be happy to send you all the details about this book. So what are we working on now? So this database has amazing things to look at. So one of the things that we're looking at right now is a very nice task that was given to those creative architects. It's a mosaic design task, okay? So you can imagine Louis Kahn walked into a room and he was given a little box. And in this box were lots of different mosaics of different colors, okay? And he was asked to create a design with mosaics that would kind of reflect a highly aesthetic or creative object. So all of these mosaic designs now exist. And I've got a really good friend of mine called Gregor Hein-Lagerung, who is in Germany, who has a really nice software that you can feed images of designs to. It's lower level features of the visual object that you're looking at. This can be, for example, something about the complexity, degree of curvature and luminance. And now we're looking to see whether the lower level visual features of designs that architects produce are correlated with the perceived aesthetic or creative qualities of the work. And we've just done some first pass correlation analysis, and lo and behold, we found that there are actually lots of interesting correlations between low-level visual features that your brain would detect and how creative a particular object is perceived to be. So it gives you a nice indication that some of the lower level features can kind of drive preference at the upper level, okay? So that was my coverage of some interesting work on creativity to kind of express to you the important work that the study of creativity in architects has meant for the scientific study of creativity, and the fact that there is really some link between the creation process and the appreciation process that's mediated by the creative artifact, in this case, architectural design. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk about the brain. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing neuroscience of architecture. This is most of the work that I do now. Not surprisingly, I consider the fMRI scanner to be a very aesthetic object, given that I spend a lot of time around it. I would have liked to have had a bit of time to talk about what the fMRI signal really means. So when I talk about a particular region of the brain is activated more, what does that really mean? But unfortunately, due to time constraints, I won't be able to do it, but I'm very happy to engage in discussion afterwards if you have questions about what my data actually mean from a neuroscientific perspective. But the first question you want to ask yourself is, why study neuroscience of architecture? The same question can be asked about psychology of architecture. Why should we study psychology of architecture? And there have been some really good surveys done in North America to show that Americans spend about 90% of their time in indoor spaces, okay, which is remarkable. And most of the other 10% is spent commuting between indoor spaces. So we're kind of dealing with indoor spaces all the time. And when this data first came out, everyone said, yeah, this is so North American, these data patterns. The rest of the world functions very differently. And then there were about 12 different countries that were looked at, all of which showed very similar patterns. So we tend to be indoors a lot these days, right? So, and we also know that features of the spaces that we live in influence how we think and feel and act. So there is a good motivation here to try and understand what those design features of the built spaces do to our mind and brain. Another reason why it's important to study psychology and neuroscience of architecture is that our aesthetic judgments of spaces have a big impact on our decisions about this. So one example that I've put here is, for example, people's aesthetic assessments of a space are the most important factor in deciding if they want to live there or not. Yeah, so this tells you something about the aesthetic factor as a determinant of decision making regarding architecture. So if you want to study features of architecture, what feature do you focus on? There's endless number to choose from. And as I always tell my psychology and neuroscience friends, if you want to do half decent work in psychology and neuroscience of architecture, find some architect and designer friends. That usually tends to be very helpful. So when we first wanted to do this work, you know, I tried to go to lots of meetings of architects and designers and to try and make inroads into the community to meet them. And I found that a lot of architects and designers are really interested in what psychology and neuroscience can contribute to the field. So we had very good discussions on what some of the good factors would be to study. And one of the ones that popped up very early was contour, okay? So why is contour interesting? So there's a very old literature in psychology, now going back over 100 years, that has shown that people prefer curved objects to angular objects. And there's some really fascinating stuff you can read from the early part of the 20th century, some of the earliest experimental psychology labs where people were brought into the labs and they were given line drawings that were either jagged or they were curvy, or they were given objects that were either kind of edgy or curved. And they were asked, which one do you like? How does this make you feel? And all of the early studies showed that people like the curvy objects over sharper objects. So in modern times, this work has been extended to car interiors, same idea, objects, same idea. And I find some of the most fascinating work comes from three areas. One is that this preference for curvature is there in infants, okay, that are just a few weeks old. They tend to track objects that are round more than those that are angular. It's consistent cross-culturally. So my friend Marcos Nadal and his team have looked at this preference in Spain, Mexico, and Ghana. it's present in those locations. And perhaps the most exciting data come from the zoo in Germany, where they looked at the great apes. So even when you present great apes with round versus angular objects, they track the round ones more and they like them more. So this tells us that there's something maybe very old and evolutionary and biological about our preference for curvature. Okay, so this work has now been extended to design. So there's beautiful work with interior design, showing that when people are looking at interior rooms, they like the curved ones more over the angular ones. So it's a beautiful study by Dasker and Reed. It's true for interior spaces, a very nice study done in Holland, where they looked at airport design. When you ask people what is it that they like about the room, they like the curved spaces more because they're curved, okay? The question is, why do they like the curved spaces more? So as a psychologist, you always care about mechanism. And there are really a couple of different explanations. One explanation is that people don't like sharp objects because they denote threat. So when we look at something sharp, we think it's associated with danger, so we shy away from it. And another explanation is that there's something about roundness that really drives us, motivates us to approach it. So and we wanted to know which of these is really the stronger driver. So there's a really great study that's been foundational in this area done by Moshe Bar and Neta. And I had the pleasure of meeting Moshe a few years ago in Germany for a meeting on aesthetics and neuroaesthetics, where he had people look at objects that were either sharp or angular or round, and he found that people liked the round objects more. But more importantly, he found that this was true even if the object wasn't a real object. So in this example, you see like the watch and the sofa, but there are also some images there that are not things you would see in your everyday life, and people still prefer the round ones. But the really important contribution that he and his team made was they had people go into the fMRI scanner and they looked at the same images. And he found that when people are looking at the sharp objects, you are seeing increased activation in the amygdala. And as you know, the amygdala is a core region of the brain that, that responds to perceptions of threat. So if you are suffering from arachnophobia, and I show you a picture of a spider, um, the amygdala lights up. If you suffer from acrophobia, and I show you a picture of a high location, it tends to agitate and the amygdala is activated. So the idea here was clear. People like curvature because they kind of are shying away from sharp objects because they seem threatening. But then I've got this good friend in the UK, Letizia Palombo, with Marco Bertamini. They did some really interesting work where the participant is shown different kinds of objects. You can see some of them are round, some of them are sharp, and they decide on a computer monitor how close they want to move the mannequin to the object. And they found that when people are looking at round objects, they move the mannequin closer. So they concluded that, yeah, it's true that people tend to shy away from sharp things, but they're also driven towards round objects because they're motivated by them. So both of these tend to be true. And I want to show you this beautiful quote by Gordon that was produced in 1909. You have to realize it's over 100 years ago, at the bottom of this slide, where she says, curves are in general felt to be more beautiful than straight lines. This idea that it's something about the feeling state that they evoke that draws to us. It's an emotional, affective response. Okay. And we thought, oh, what a wonderful hypothesis to test, you know, have people go inside the fMRI scanner and first see if they like curved architecture over sharp architecture, but also see whether the brain's emotion system is underlying this preference. So our prediction was very simple. Have people go into the fMRI scanner, show them images of rooms that are either angular or round, first behaviorally see what they prefer, and also see what's happening in the brain when they're exhibiting preference for a round object, okay? So this is a sketch of the brain's emotion system. As you can see, it has lots of different components, all of which do different things. So it's important to realize that the brain's emotion system is not small, it's very large and it's connected to lots of different regions. But our hypothesis was that a structure within the brain's emotion system will show sensitivity to the impact of contour in design. So these are examples of the slides that we use. So we have a very nice slide deck of 200 images now that have been standardized for contour and ceiling height and enclosure. It's either closed or open. And they've been standardized in terms of luminance and other psychophysical properties that have been used in lots of different studies now. So if anybody who's listening to this lecture suddenly feels inspired to do a new experiment on psychology or neuroscience of design tomorrow morning, and you're looking for good images on which there's lots of standardized data, all you have to do is email me and I'll give you the link to the Dropbox and you can just download all the images. Okay. The images were put together by two working architects and designers in Denmark who basically spent many, many weeks going through architectural databases online and kind of putting together the perfect set that they both agreed on. All right. So these are curved rooms. These are more images of curved rooms. Okay. So these are rectilinear spaces. You know, if you, for anyone here who's a parent, you would not be sending your child to any of these rooms. I can tell you. Okay. It's rife with danger. Okay. This one also, lots of rectilinear aspects to this design. Okay. And first question, always as a psychologist, I never will look at fMRI data before I analyze the behavioral data. Okay. So we always collect behavioral data. I'm always really interested in people's behavioral judgments because without them, it's very difficult to interpret the neural data. So we looked at the behavioral data and we found, as we had hypothesized, that when a room is round, people are significantly more likely to find it beautiful, but the effect is not there for square rooms. Okay. So behaviorally, we get the expected result. So the region of the brain that we found was sensitive to a perception of curvature in beauty judgment is the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is a core part of the brain's emotion system, but also plays an important role in attention. Okay. So this is consistent with the idea that a region within the brain's larger emotion network will be sensitive to curvature in design. Now, an important question to ask is, well, has this result been replicated? And that's a very important question because, as you know, many results in neuroscience are never replicated. So if we were lucky because a couple of years after our study was done, there's a very, so this is another thing I wanted to show you before I move to the follow-up study, is after people left the fMRI scanner, we showed them all the images that they had seen inside the scanner, but we also asked them to rate them on, again, beauty, but also pleasantness. So pleasantness is the valence dimension for measuring affect. So people who study emotion give pleasantness scales all the time. And we found that the pleasantness ratings for these architectural spaces, they explained over 60% of the variance in beauty judgments. Okay, that's also consistent with the affect hypothesis. So the reason why you find a space to be beautiful is to a large extent driven by how pleasant you find that space to be. Okay, that's consistent with what we saw in the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, in this study that I mentioned that was done a couple of years later by Banai and colleagues, they had a very cool design, much cooler than the design for our study. So they had so they equip people with portable EEG. Okay, so remember, in our study, people are sort of not mobile in the fMRI scanner, looking at images, pressing buttons, beautiful, not beautiful. Okay, it's very static. And what they're looking at is not really dynamic. So in Banai and colleagues' study, everybody was equipped with portable EEG, which is really wonderful. So they were actually allowed to move. And they were also presented with virtual reality goggles. Okay, and the virtual reality goggles presented them images of rooms that were either curved or rectilinear. Okay, not the same images we had used, but same idea. Okay, and the person wearing a portable EEG device and virtual reality was actually able to navigate in this virtual space. Okay, so it's a very, very clever design, very nice paper. I really love this paper. So and these are examples of the rooms that they were looking at in the virtual reality module. And what they found is that when they were looking at round rooms, they preferred them more. And source localization showed that the brain activity was coming from the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, which is the same region that we found in our fMRI study. So this shows you that maybe there is something real about the contribution of the anterior cingulate cortex to perception of curvature in design, because it appears not only with the fMRI signal when people are looking at static images, but also based on the EEG signal when they're actually moving through a space in virtual reality. Okay. So I was very happy about this study coming out. Okay, so that was the story about contour. Okay, so in other words, we've been able to show, along with a number of other people, that that contour is one of those design features in architecture that you can manipulate, and it impacts people's preference level and brain activation. Okay, so there's something about contour that people are really sensitive to, even in the context of architecture. Okay. But the next thing we looked at is ceiling height, because there's also been lots of work on ceiling height. So I don't know about Israel, but in North America, there's a building standard for how high the roof, the ceiling in your room can be. So it's 2.44 meters. Okay, so if you're a builder, you have to abide by this law. Okay, but people like rooms with higher ceilings, and they pay way more for apartments, especially in Toronto, with higher ceilings. Okay, so it's not clear exactly why that's happening, but the fact that people are willing to economically invest in high ceiling means that it's a strong driver of decision making. So again, I love old studies in psychology because some of them are so clever. And this is such a beautiful study that was done in the 1970s, where you can see they manipulated ceiling height and they looked at mean preference level. And you can see that where the peak is, it's a little bit higher than what you see in a normal building code ceiling. But what I really love about this study is that, as opposed to just showing people pictures of rooms, they had people go into a room where they could manipulate the height of the ceiling to where they liked it most. Okay, and they showed that, lo and behold, people like rooms with higher ceilings. It's a beautiful finding. 1970s, far before fMRI, but clearly very enlightening. So, well, where would this happen in the brain? So in the brain, we kind of have two different streams for visual processing that people who do work in neuroscience will be very familiar with. There's what's called the ventral stream, which is what you see in red, which is the pathway for processing characteristics of objects. So, how big is it? What is its shape? What is the texture of what it is that you're looking at? And then we have this dorsal stream that you see in blue that's more about spatial localization, about location and movement and spatial relationships. So we hypothesized that ceiling height is probably going to be um, uh, more readily analyzed via the dorsal stream because it has to do with spatial relationships. Okay, so we hypothesized that when you have people in the fMRI scanner looking at rooms that are either high or low in ceilings, that manipulation will activate regions in a dorsal stream. So these are examples of the rooms. So really high ceiling rooms. A lot of our participants afterwards always asked, oh, it would be so great to live in these spaces. I have yet to walk into an apartment that looks like this. I'm sure they exist somewhere, probably in Denmark. So these are rooms with lower ceilings, what typically most of us would be living in. Okay, so behaviorally, again, we found that when people are looking at high ceilings, they tend to like them more likely to consider them to be beautiful. So behaviorally, the effect is there as expected. And from a neural perspective, we found that when people are looking at rooms with high ceilings, this activates regions in the precuneus and the middle frontal gyrus, which fall within the dorsal stream. Okay, and our explanation here is that people probably like rooms with higher ceilings because those spaces allow them more visual spatial exploration, which we find pleasurable. Okay, so if you are in a small room, very little opportunity to visually explore. But if you find yourself in a big room, we find this all the time when we go to people who have houses with higher ceilings, we kind of we find ourselves scanning the environment, and this likely activates the brain's dorsal visual system, which correlates with higher preference levels for those spaces. So we think the mechanism is visual spatial exploration. Okay. I hope I haven't gone through the material too fast yet. And I hope you're making lots of questions that we can get to later. Okay, and the next one is probably the one that's been studied the most by environmental psychologists. So as you know, environmental psychology is one of the newest fields in psychology, and some really great journals devoted to this area. And there's been a lot of work in environmental psychology on kind of enclosed versus open spaces and how this impacts how people feel and think. Okay. And when people in environmental psychology talk about enclosure, what they really are talking about is what they talk about permeability. So if you find yourself sitting in a room, is the room allowing you visual permeability? So can you kind of see far? And also, does it allow you locomotive permeability? Can you imagine yourself moving through that space? Okay, so the idea is that if you find yourself in a room where you can imagine yourself moving through it, it's perceived to be more open. And we have a lot of data showing that people like those spaces more. And one of the big old theories that we have in this area is what's called prospect theory from Appleton, that has linked this to kind of biological survival. So historically and evolutionarily, people liked living in spaces that allowed them visual permeability, so they could see far, but they could also hide if they wanted to. So kind of nice interchange between these two things. And if you are in a space that doesn't allow you to actually see far, this enclosure causes stress. And a beautiful study was done to show that a few years ago by Lars Bersen-Fick. He's part of our architecture team for our fMRI studies. So he too is in Denmark, where he did a very cool study where people were asked to give something that a lot of people in North America and elsewhere find very stressful, which is public speaking. Okay, so the way this task works, it's the Trier stress task. It's kind of like a public speaking task where you're kind of giving some kind of an interview. Okay, and there's been lots of research to show that this kind of situation causes stress in people. But what he was able to do using virtual reality again, which I thought was very clever, was people gave this interview under two different conditions, either in a condition where the room perceptually was open or perceptually was closed. Everything else was the same. Okay, and he found that when people are giving this kind of mock interview in a room that's perceptually closed, you get a big spike in cortisol. Okay, and as you know, cortisol that you can measure through saliva is a very reliable biomarker for stress. So people who are stressed are releasing more cortisol. So I was able to show that, hey, people don't like being in closed spaces because when they're in them, they feel more stressed. They're more susceptible to stress. Okay. So in our study, again, we had images of rooms that are either open or closed. So these are examples of open spaces where you can see there's lots of visual and locomotive permeability. These are rooms that are enclosed where you don't kind of have that kind of possibility. Again, behaviorally, we found that when people are looking at open rooms, they're significantly more likely to find them beautiful, okay? And these activated regions in the brain that are triggered by attention. So in other words, when people are looking at enclosed versus open spaces, this modulates how they pay attention to that space. And what we found really interesting is that when they're looking at enclosed spaces, this activates a region called the anterior midcingulate cortex, which has very strong connections to a region I talked about earlier, which is the amygdala. Okay, meaning that, so in our study, as one part of our study, which I haven't talked about so far because of time restrictions, is we didn't only look at beauty judgments, but we also looked at approach avoidance decisions. So, okay, the first question is, do you like this room or not? Great. Do you want to enter this room or not? Okay, and we found that when people are looking at enclosed spaces and they want to leave those spaces, this activates the anterior midcingulate cortex, which has very strong connections to the amygdala, which of course is an important region of the brain for threat perception. So again, there's something about an enclosed space that denotes a sense of danger. It's probably a very old evolutionary response that stayed with us, that's still triggering our aesthetic responses. Okay, so the conclusions from the fMRI work overall are that the basic physical and geometric features in design influence our attitudes and choices and brain function. Okay, so our brain is really sensitive to features of design embedded within architecture, and it can really isolate them and respond to them. We also now know that the neural data combined with psychological data, they actually give you the opportunity to test some really interesting hypotheses. Okay, so if you, for example, thought that a particular aesthetic feature in design feature in architecture might be driven by emotion, you now have an opportunity to really test that. Okay, if you think that it might be driven by how people visual spatially explore a space, they're not real tools to test that. So the neural data kind of have given us this extra level of insight that we can put with the behavioral data to have a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of choice. And the really important reason why all of this work is done is that the initial step of finding some interesting behavioral effects and neural effects, it's kind of like an intermediary step. What we really care about is, at least what I really care about, is being able to share all of this data with architects and designers to get their insights on the value of our findings for the practice of architecture and design. The idea here being that what we ultimately want to do is we want to optimize the spaces that we live and work in. And if there can be a nice dialogue between the scientists and the architects and designers to find ways to optimize those spaces for the end users, this will be the real big outcome of this research field. Okay. Now, what are some of the recent things that I've been working on? Not me, but some very clever who also choose to work with me, which is nice, is that we've been really focusing on individual differences. So I go to lots of meetings with architects and designers where I present my findings. And a lot of the early work that I've done, like the stuff that I talked about today, it kind of had to do with people with no experience in architecture and design, kind of naive end users. And a lot of times when I presented this work to architects and designers, they said, well, you know, our reaction to these things will be very different. Okay, do you have any data that can tell us something about how architects and designers are affected by these design features? So we've now begun doing some really good work on that. So I collected some really nice data from working architects and designers in Toronto that were published last year, in which I looked at the effect of contour on preference. And we found that when you are looking at aesthetic judgments, the impact of contour is even stronger in designers and architects than it is in naive participants. Okay, which I thought was very telling. You know, it's considered to be a low-level design feature, and some people would think that maybe it's not going to be as important for architects and designers. Now we know that if you're talking about aesthetic assessments, it's very important. Okay, but it's less important if you ask people if they want to approach a space. for people with no experience in architecture, they want to approach spaces that are curved over angular, but that seems not to be the case when we're talking about actual architects and designers. So we get the effect for aesthetic judgment, but not the effect for approach avoidance decisions, which shows that if you are comparing how architects and designers respond to design features, you have to take the actual task into consideration. Okay, there are some subtle task effects that can modulate how an expert views a space that need to be taken into consideration. Another thing that we've looked at in terms of individual differences is whether neurotypical development has an impact on preferences. So I've been doing this work with this good friend and colleague of mine that I spoke about earlier, Letizia Palumbo. She's in Liverpool in the UK. She has been doing work on contour also for a long time with Marco Bertamini. So she has worked with people with autism spectrum disorder. So in the UK, there is all kinds of programs for building residential and care facilities for people with autism spectrum disorder. And there's a really big interest to optimize the spaces for that specific population. So they had come across our work on contour, and the work had sort of shown that people tend to like round spaces more. And they thought, well, wouldn't this be nice to see whether this is also true for people with autism spectrum disorder, in which case, if you have to build living and working environments for them, we can embed that feature in the design and optimize their living environment. So we did a study that was just published, in which we looked to see whether amongst people with autism spectrum disorder, you get the same preference for contour, and we found that you don't. Okay, and that's really interesting because, as you know, people with autism spectrum disorder have a different profile of both emotional and perceptual processing. Okay, and if you remember, the explanation for our contour effect in a general population is an emotion affective driven explanation. So we went in hypothesizing that, look, the emotional processing and profile in autism spectrum disorder is different than what you see in normal controls. So maybe the effect will not be there. And we found that it's not there. So it's like a really nice example of a case where we got to work with people who work with autism spectrum disorder population to try and see whether the findings that we have can inform the design of their residential and working environments. So long-term goals, we know that aesthetic aspects of design have an impact on health and well-being. It's a really big literature. If Maya invites me to give another lecture next year, I'll come back and carry on this lecture and talk about all these great effects that we found on health and well-being, which are in some ways incredibly important. I mean, I've talked about aesthetic preference, but aesthetics has impacts on kind of other things downstream that people can really tune into, and I think can be emphasized to really share our findings with a larger culture. And that there's a real opportunity here for psychology and neuroscience to contribute to evidence-based design. But I, as I've mentioned before, I really very strongly feel that for this field to be successful, the psychologists and the neuroscientists and the designers and the end users have to work together. And these groups are not always interacting. Unfortunately, there's not sufficient exchange of ideas. But I think if all of us came to the same table, there's huge amounts of learning to be done, that not only can we hope to inform the design process, but we hope to learn from designs and architects to inform the way we do psychology and neuroscience. So to have a really nice bi-directional exchange to move the field forward. Okay, and on that note, I think I'm going to end my lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that we can have a good discussion now.